Welcome to another episode of Grief Talk. Everything you want to know about grief and more. I'm your host, Vonne Solis. As an author, life transformation coach, online instructor, and bereaved mom since 2005, I'll be bringing you great content that is informative, inspiring, and practical. Whether you have suffered a loss or other adversity, stay tuned and tapped in as I cover a variety of topics to help you get where you want to go on your journey to heal and grow. Today's guest is Deeann Graham, the award-winning author of Head On, Stories of Alopecia, and an alopecia coach, consultant, educator, and advocate. She was first diagnosed with alopecia areata when she was 7 years old. Deeann published Head On, Stories of Alopecia, to share stories and photos of people around the world who are living with alopecia in order to provide a broad perspective on the journey of hair loss. Educating communities in order to empower others who have been diagnosed, especially in the beauty and medical industries, is an important part of Deeann's outreach. She is also the host of the Alopecia Life podcast, where she continues to educate and share stories to help others realize that they are not alone. Okay, so welcome again to the show, Deeann. I am so excited to have you here.
And thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. So for my audience, viewers and listeners, as per the introduction, Deeann is an advocate in the alopecia world, and some of you might be wondering, what has alopecia got to do with bereavement and grief? And the answer is one of the main focuses I have for this podcast show is to introduce people to the concept that grief can affect us in many different ways. And I will wager every one of us suffers grief at some point in our life, even if it is for varying times. When we're living with disabilities or losses that aren't necessarily human loss, most of the time culturally, if not all of the time, we tend to dismiss it as something that we get over. We do not pay any attention to the grief aspect. So it is my absolute honor to have Deeann here with us today and talk a little bit about her world and what it's like to experience alopecia in terms of herself, her family, the community, the culture. And this is to bring awareness to everyone about not only alopecia and the grief that may be associated with that, but to also help those of us who do live with losses of different types feel a little bit more included in mainstream society. So on that note, I would like to turn it over to you, Deeann, if you could tell us a little bit about your experience when you were diagnosed, how it affected your family, your parents, and you over the years. Let's start with that.
I'd love to. Thanks again. So I was diagnosed when I was 7 years old. And when that happens, when you're young, you look to the guidance of your parents or adults in your life. And they were given a certain amount of guidance from other adults, right? Doctors and teachers and things like that, saying these are the expectations we have, or this is what is available to you. And it's interesting when we talk about loss, because within the alopecia community, hair loss, I mean, it's right there in the name, right? And so living with that kind of loss is interesting because there's not a lot of attention given to it. And you kind of go, okay, this is something that's going on. And it's not as bad as other things. And when you're young, you don't really understand that. But as an adult, I did have regrowth. So at 7, I was probably bald for about 7 more years, and my hair spontaneously grew back when I was about 14. And then I had significant loss when I had my daughter when I was about 28. And so as an adult, I looked at loss a little bit different, right? More mature in a different way. And I thought, this is interesting. Why am I so superficial? Why is this hitting me in a similar manner than just as like when I was 7 years old? And so you have to really look deep in yourself and go, why is this loss a loss. And then I think the confusion really is around people telling us too. It's outside influence going, oh, at least it's just this. You don't have cancer. You don't have this. You haven't lost a limb. You haven't. And so everybody's inserting their ways of thinking about loss.
Yeah, I noticed one of the things I noticed, I was visiting your website, which I think is wonderful. And one of the things that caught me about what you said is, I think it was in your video introducing your course, which we'll talk about in just a few questions. But it was the expectation of how you were supposed to show up in the world. You, and by you, you representing the alopecia community. And I really am interested in hearing your views on that, because as a bereaved mother, I can tell you for sure there is a connection with grief as to the expectation of the way that not only our different communities work, social, volunteer, anything, even I would dare say even churches, there is an expectation of the way that we're going to show up, and certainly one from families. And you know what, like you just finished saying, it's just hair loss. It's not that big a deal. And but it is a really big deal. And in the case of many expectations, one of them is that we are going to be normal and or recover from whatever has impacted us as a loss. So I just wondered if you could share a little bit what you experienced, how you felt, or I should say what you felt the expectation was to show up. What did that look like for you?
Well, it was kind of personal at first, right? I mean, you have to convince yourself to show up in a way that is kind of new to you. It's not, yeah, you look different. And so looking at yourself is one thing in the mirror, then going, oh, I'm going to now present myself to the world in whatever way that looks like. And the expectation was for me to cover it, right? Very young. Like I was telling you, my parents listened to a teacher who said, oh, she needs to, cover that up. And they were like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Right. Let's just get a wig and she'll wear a wig for the rest of her life. And so it was the expectation of what was acceptable at school. We didn't want to draw attention away from the curriculum or learning or whatever we want to think and whatever it may have been. And that was just one teacher. And so it's interesting how it guided the rest of my life, because when I then lost my hair again, it was the question of how do I want to show up in the world, right? But it took a long time. I had very just lost the, tufts of hair sticking out here and there. And I never wanted to shave. My husband kept saying, do you want to just shave it off? Do you want to just shave it off? And that can be a very empowering experience. But I was so connected to that last strand, thinking, okay, once the last strand goes, then I'll be able to decide what to do. And so it was kind of a protective mechanism, I think, in me going, okay, you'll get there when you get there, whenever that will be. And so when I decided to present myself with this new look, it was covered still. I wore a hat, a pretty tacky hat, to tell you the truth. It was something that was available, but I learned so much. I thought, okay, you cover your ears with a hat, you can't even hear correctly. It's different, right? So you now have this hat that's covering your ear, or you wear something that's just coming out and then your ears stick out around it, and it's kind of wonky looking. So there's that. And so it was a progression. I think that as I started to put my book together, and we'll probably talk about my book later, I was wearing a bandana in the summertime, I kind of was matching everything to my outfit. So I have probably, 30 or 40 different color bandanas. And that was my next transition from like wearing a wig to a hat to a bandana. And then I said, you know what, I need to live in the world in this way. And it was really important for me to show up as that person, because I was then going to talk about my book, which featured people about, living with alopecia. And I thought, if I'm not living the life that is authentic to me, then who am I? And so that's kind of how it went. But I also didn't know what was authentic to me until that point when I actually did it. So
So, what you're just saying is so important, Deann, because you and I met in the business world last year, but I immediately was drawn to you because I see so many similarities. And again, even though we don't talk about them, and probably nobody would sit there and go, oh, someone with hair loss is suffering similarly to someone who lost a child. But the truth is, we do suffer the same. We do feel some of the same things. And it is very personal. And you do have to hide who you are in the world. And you do have to make yourself show up. And you do have to struggle with authenticity. And very much like what you just said, you know, writing your book, obviously as a mature adult, and being able to have some introspection and decide. Well, when I say decide, reach the point where you can decide how you want to show up, which again, I believe you referred to. It's a process. It can take years. But I've gone through the very same thing because it's a community. We both live in communities that, while they're minority communities, and people still do, have child, lose children. People still do suffer with alopecia. Kids are dying every day. People are being diagnosed with alopecia every day. It is a very similar journey. One of the things I want to move into, and this will be a segue into that, is when you were just talking about the physical things that you did, what was happening with your hair in clumps, and being told to wear a hat and then getting a variety of bandanas, which is probably really cool. You probably look really cool in bandanas, I just want to say. But if you could go back, or you have gone back, and this question is important to help parents today, is as a child, your inner child, what do you think that you have carried, or you carried into adulthood and have dealt with, that impacted you emotionally and maybe even mentally, from understanding you were different, from people making you literally understand you were different, but not necessarily, you would not have had the tools probably at 7, 8, 9, 10, not until adulthood really, to understand authenticity and the choice you have to kind of choose how you want to present in the world. And the reason I want to ask if you want to address any of that, because I never want to get too personal with my guests, but if you do want to address some of the lingering emotional damage, other people treating you that way, and parents succumbing to that kind of advice, which may do today they may do today in certain parts of the world. What kind of marks does that leave on children?
I think it can leave a huge mark. And I know for me personally, it, up until you talked about community, and up until I met a community and was able to talk about it, because I didn't talk about it, right? It was very quiet, very silent. People didn't understand around me. My own family, who loved me, of course, and I, did everything that they could, just didn't understand. And so when I started meeting other people who understood, when I started writing about my own experience, journaling about it, and then putting the book together, I actually put my entire book together and didn't write my story until the very last story, because I was so unsure of what I wanted to say. And I would be tearing up and crying when I was writing it. So obviously there's some stuff that lingers, right? I mean, there's all sorts of messaging that I actually don't think I took messaging from my parents. It was more about really understanding that outside influences impact everybody, and they're all coming from a different space. And my parents were coming from living in the 70s. This is the way things were done. We didn't talk about it. That was very normal for the time, and I can look at that as an adult and totally accept that. And then even the kids who teased me at school, as an adult, I look at that and say, okay, this is the influence, this is why this was happening. And I take that into what I do as a coach. When I talk to families, I'm like, we didn't talk about it. Guess what? Opening up conversations and sharing about what's happening with your child can, I'm not going to say it's going to get rid of the bullies, because they exist, but it does open up enough dialogue that kids feel free to talk about it when back when I was young, that wasn't the case. So yeah, I do think there's lingering messaging that does stick, but I do feel also that, yeah, like I said, it's just I moved through that process and there's nothing of that left. So I'm just really happy about that.
Absolutely. And it makes you an expert in what you teach and what the resources that you have to share. And I am going to ask you about that related to this next question, which is I know that you say on your website that today, 40 odd decades later, 4 decades, not 40. Sorry, Deann. Oops.
I'm not that
Or
old.
I know, either am I. Okay, 4 decades later, some of the same, stuff is still missing. And I know you were saying, some of the things that, and I want to get into a little bit about exactly how you can help parents and, their children diagnosed with alopecia, both individuals as adults and children diagnosed. And so you say that parents are still struggling. Some of the same things there's gaps that are still missing today that were when you were a child. And I know, and one of the things that caught me, because I'm telling you, it is exactly the same in my world. It's the medical support, and with no disrespect to anybody in the medical community trying to help, there is a huge gap in how they understand my world as a bereaved parent. And I know what you say that, and the other thing I note that you say, again, very similar, is parental guilt. Guilt. There's some regrets. There's too many options. I wasn't sure that I understood what you meant by too many options. So I was just wondering if you could explain why you think there is a gap still with medical professionals, resources, and this parental too many options for parents.
Right. So when I say too many options, I'm talking about everything that's offered, right? You go, oh, well, you should take this biotin. Well, you could do this, you could do that, and we'll test for this and that, but it won't really be effective. They do some very baseline blood work, and sometimes they don't even offer blood work in when you go to the doctor, which is interesting because I do believe that you should look at inflammatory markers. You should look at vitamin D and iron, obviously, because you could have some underlying things that are easy to supplement. And then, perhaps you might have regrowth, right? Or it might just encourage some hair growth. But the bigger piece of it, the gap is with the emotional piece of it. When they're telling parents at appointments, oh, your child has stress, and they're looking at their 15-month-old child, and you're like, what kind of stress? Because we interpret stress to be something that we can't handle in our lives, right? We go, oh, this is happening because I just can't handle this kind of XYZ, whatever it might be. And there are things that happen. And so a lot of this rabbit hole that people go down is, what's the trigger, right? We each have a genetic component that plays into autoimmunity. And in this case, it's hair loss. But what is the trigger? And sometimes you might discover that the trigger is trauma, is a vaccine, is getting a virus, is getting dental work. I mean, the amount of things that could have triggered this are huge, right? And there's so many ideas that people have, and they go to their doctor and they say, I think this caused this, and the doctor's like, oh, that absolutely not, that's impossible, right? And so that's kind of where I go with the overwhelm piece of it, because you get into that and you start saying, how can I fix what this is? There's a genetic component, so now I'm blaming myself as a parent, and then and then so it's just kind of sends you into a spiral. And I think that's something that everybody can understand.
I totally know the rabbit hole. And again, similarly, and the reason I'm interjecting with, my world is for those listeners and viewers out there to really understand and the similarities that a devastation of a diagnosis for a parent can be equal to understanding, first learning your child has died, or even another loved one. There is the shock, there's the trauma, there's the absolute guilt that can last a lifetime. If you're looking for enough reasons why something happened, it can definitely last a lifetime. So again, what do you think that parents are most struggling then with today? Because I know I am also going to ask you. Let me do this as a twofold question. What has changed today for parents? And then, in terms of what you just finished saying, are there other struggles that parents are dealing with today?
Yes. So let's do the struggles
Yeah.
first. I think with anything, we're taking baggage from our life as being young people and bringing them into parenting a lot of the time. And we're like, oh, my child's going to have a hard time at the beginning of kindergarten because they don't have any hair and all their peers will have hair, or they're going to have trouble in junior high. That's a big one, right? Oh my gosh, junior high, which is a really difficult age, right? So we have assumptions about how our child is going to be treated by others. And we just go into future tripping, right? We just go, oh my gosh, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. And because it happened to us as parents. And so we assume that these things are naturally going to happen for our children. And that's not the way the world is right now. Our children actually are being raised in ways that are so open to diversity, so accepting of things when we give them the chance to, right? And so what was true back when we were young is not true today. So I think that a lot of that is happening. And I coach people around families around school. That's probably my biggest module also in my course, because it's such a big one, right? How to talk about it with school and how to introduce it. So that's kind of the big piece of that. I forgot the first part of the
Oh,
question.
no, that was it. We were just sort of talking about struggle, but I had made some notes here. And actually, why don't we get into a little bit about there? I know I'm looking at my notes because I can't always remember everything, but your common issues were, how to talk to the child who's been diagnosed, how to introduce alopecia at school, connection with others. And I know there was the one here, and I love this one. How to deal with unsolicited advice from family and strangers. So some of those. So why don't you? I think what would be really helpful is this, and we'll move to your teaching now and your own resources, your book, your solutions. How would a parent talk to their child today that would be different from how you were treated as a child?
I love what one parent, Mimi is one of my go-to parents. She was featured in my book with her son, Andre, and she talks about giving children agency and really talking about body autonomy. And she said she would wish she would have done it different. Her son was diagnosed, I think, when he was around 7. And that's when I was diagnosed too. So it was really interesting to hear that. And he's now 17. And so she said going in, and she's also a medical practitioner, by the way. She's a nurse practitioner. So she's in the medical world. She knew what she was seeing, but she wanted confirmation. But then she said, okay, we went into these appointments and the doctor's like, we're going to do this. And then she would look at her son and say, how does that sound to you? Right. And that never would have happened in an appointment, that they would have been like, oh, the doctor says to do this, and that's what we're going to do. Right. So that is a real difference where that just has changed so much. But I still see it not happening. I just was coaching a parent yesterday and I said, go into that appointment, ask for what you want. They're probably not going to volunteer to give it to you. So, and I don't want to be, totally a downer for people when they go to appointments, but I'm like, you've been waiting 5 months for this appointment. Ask for what you want, know what blood tests you want, know to check these things out. And I'm not a medical professional, so I don't really speak to specific things like that, but I do encourage them to really be bold and ask for what they want. So I think that is a difference that we're hoping to, the more we talk about it, the better we can all become when we go into an appointment, that especially when we've been waiting months to get in.
No kidding. So how do you guide parents And do you actually work with older individuals who have been diagnosed with alopecia, or mostly parents?
I do work with women mostly, but it I really am drawn to working with families more than anything. That I just know that's where I think I'm meant to be. And it's not because I have a child living with alopecia, but I was a child. And so I'm giving them kind of a different perspective on what they want to hear from me. When I did my beta course, they're like, we want to know how it affected you. We want to know what you think. And I kept thinking, wow, okay, that's really interesting. I kind of thought let's gear it towards your own child, but they are so in the dark about it that they just want to know what maybe my perspective was. And I have a base of knowledge from so many different people, just from doing the book and then interviewing people on the podcast. It just broadens my perspective too, knowing what other people feel and express to me. So I think that that's really helpful too.
So I'm just, from the outside, I can tell you, you sound like a living legend. And seriously, and it is the person that has acquired some longevity with an experience that has wisdom to share with others. So we are the teachers of what we need to be the teachers of. Unfortunately, maybe our experiences aren't great and aren't welcoming, and maybe are not experienced by the masses. But for those that are suddenly thrown into a world that is sudden, certainly not expected, identifies you as different in the mainstream. We need to have voices in these areas. And again, I really feel that the lack of empowerment. So a lot of the work I do is, about empowering grievers to make decisions. So when you speak about parents in the alopecia world waiting 5 months or longer for an appointment, and, it can be scary to ask your medical professional for something specific or challenge them on something. And so I think that's really important that you're working in that area. I was going to ask you about community for alopecia sufferers. I don't know. I don't want to really call you sufferers, but maybe you can explain that term as well. Like what are people, or how do you identify as someone living with alopecia?
So that is up for debate, right? Because that is a big question. A lot of people call themselves alopecians, and I'm not super keen on that term, but that's okay. It's no big deal. The suffering piece of it, I definitely it's cringeworthy a little bit, because you go, are we all suffering? No, absolutely not. I mean, I have a girlfriend who has, I think she was 17 months old when she was diagnosed. And she's like, why do people keep saying we're suffering? And that's in the news, right? And they're like, oh, so-and-so suffering from alopecia. Most of the time, that's about mindset, right? I mean, are we suffering or are we thriving? Are we living our lives the way we're supposed to be? Are we working through it? Are we figuring it out? But definitely, I'm so glad that you asked the question, Vonne, because suffering, it doesn't have to be the reality of what's going on, for sure.
Exactly. And so I would ask you then, in terms of your own resources and sort of linking that to community, what is community support like? Certainly you're in the States, and I'm in Canada. I have no idea what it's like in Canada. And there are many people that remain unaware of, you live with a condition that is like, again, bereavement. Unless it happens to you, you're not really aware of it. That is a fact. That is a fact. I know in my world there is not enough resources and community support in terms of support groups, the right information on resource materials. For example, a big missing piece in my world is trauma related to grief. I'm sure there can be some trauma related to alopecia as well. But moving into the community side of things, which your work is is, I'm thinking, a big part of, and I want to hear about that next, everything that you do and resources you offer. As the community, is there enough support or resources in communities? Can people easily find them in their various states when they're looking for help on alopecia? Like, what's that like?
No, I do think that there's great resources, but I don't think it's easily accessible even by Googling. So a lot of people will just put alopecia areata in, and it might come up with the one main nonprofit. And that's been around for probably almost as long as I've had alopecia, but I didn't know about it until about 10 years ago. And so, which, the internet really wasn't happening for a ton of time when I was, of course, young. But I think that it really starts at the top, right? And the top meaning you just got diagnosed at your doctor's office. Now what happens? They just give you an injection or a cream or whatever, and then they say, come back in 45 days. They don't say, hey, these are great resources for you. I'm going to give you the name of two nonprofits, one for the Children's Alopecia Project, which is all over the world, but mostly here in the United States. And I think there's one group in Mexico, but they're really driven by parent volunteers for each group in these different states. And then there's the National Alopecia Areata Foundation. And then, of course, I want them to tell them about me, right? Because
Yes.
I think I'm a good resource too.
You are a good resource. So let's Deeann is a wonderful resource, and I have been to your website and I was so impressed. Okay. So let's talk about your resources, Deeann. And I know you have a book. I know you have a podcast. I know you have a course. You've taught it live, and I believe it is going online, or if it isn't online already. How would you like you talk about those in any order to help people?
Yeah. So I'll talk about the book first because it was my real introduction to talking to other people about alopecia. I really hadn't done that. And I went to my first conference, a National Alopecia Areata conference in Missouri. It was the first one I ever attended. And I said, well, I can write about my own story, but that's about 2 pages long. And then I thought everybody else has stories to tell too. And let's go start to meet some of these people. So it took me several years to really, I don't just have people trust me. It's not like I'm not trustworthy, but it was work, right? I mean, you're communicating with people. I didn't want to go on Facebook at the time. I was like, I don't want to go on this platform. And that actually has been the most resourceful platform for me over the years. So I'm glad I actually jumped in on that. But I started to reach out to people at the conference and say, hey, this is who I am. I'd like to do something like this. Are you interested? And of course, the more stories you hear, the more interesting stories there are that you find. And then other people were like, oh, you should interview so-and-so, you should have that. But it was kind of the book itself is stories, but they're also black and white photos. So there's photographers involved, and they had to have releases for stories and photographs. And then, but I would say the overwhelming support from people who contributed stories and photos was amazing. It was almost like it was meant to happen when it did, no matter how long I thought about it, no matter how long I worked on it beforehand. When I actually started doing the actual work, it was from like October to May, and everything was done within those few months. And so I think that for me came from this need to have another resource or a resource, because I wasn't finding any. There were books about personal stories, one person's story about alopecia or living bald in a world of hairy people, which was great. But I wanted to do the range of hair loss, which is all, patchy hair loss, complete scalp loss, complete body loss. And I wanted to also feature women, men, and children from all over the world. So that was a little bit of a project, and I was really happy with the results. And I think people who I know that people who contributed their stories are just happy that it's out there, that they can share and help other people along the journey, because that's what it's all about. If you can help the next person down the road, that's the best thing you can do. So that's where it started for me.
So, Deann, I just want to interject really quickly here for, again, our audience, listeners, and viewers. I'll put a link with this podcast to your all of your resources, including your book. But can you just give a shout out? What is the name of your book again, Deann?
Yes, my book is titled Head On Stories of Alopecia. And my husband actually helped with the name. He actually helps with all the names. We're kind of randomly, we were driving on the freeway and he's like, what about Head On? Because we were just throwing it around. And I also want to do a shout out for my sister, my older sister, Kristen, who actually set the entire book up and made it look the way it does. So we worked, I flew her up from California and we worked in our pajamas at the dining room table, all of that stuff. And then on the phone, fixing little typos and stuff when she went home. So it was kind of a definitely a collaborative effort overall.
Yeah. And is that available on Amazon, and where else would it be available?
Yep. And it's also definitely on Amazon, and then through my website, headonpublishing.com, and also at my main website, alopecialife.com. You can purchase it off there too.
Excellent. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your course?
Yeah. So this has been a long time coming. I didn't really know this is where I would be with this. I thought, oh, I'll do maybe a membership or I'll just keep coaching. And I really wanted something that could reach a lot of people in their own time. So I thought, okay, let's just do an online course for families. And so this is specifically for parents or caregivers who are taking care of all the needs of their child and with alopecia and are just really lost. That, if you've had alopecia for 20 years and this isn't something for you, or if you're totally cool with how you're living with alopecia and you've figured it all out, this isn't for you. And I also don't talk about I kind of think it's important to say what you don't do in your course. And I don't give medical advice. I don't talk about treatments. I stay away from that because I'm not a medical provider and am not authorized to do that. But I also think you can really get caught in the weeds with those conversations. And so the course itself is really, it's almost like it starts from your diagnosis and then all the questions that come in as parents. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? And then my kids ask me about that. What about the siblings? What do I say to grandma when she wants to offer a wig for the 10th time, and my child doesn't want to wear a wig? And so there's all these conversations that I've had with people over the years, and I insert them in the course to help people understand that they're not alone. That's the biggest thing, is people do not need to feel alone in this, because large amounts of people are, we're talking, I think right now the numbers are 2% of the population, which is about 152 million people around the world. So, but we always think we're alone.
Oh, I know. And again, it's again, your reasons for writing your books, your reason for doing your course, the reason you're doing your podcast. I mean, it's just so similar to my own journey, because and I also wanted to just comment about people maybe not being overly responsive, or like, where are my people? Because these are subjects, like when it becomes so personal like that, and we're so conditioned to be wired only for our wins, our successes. Nobody wants to hear about problems unless they're going through them too. And as I've written about fairly extensively, when we can't identify with the pain, we really don't want to hear about it, which means there's a huge gap in our level of an ability to demonstrate empathy and compassion for each other. It's interesting, Deann, and I'm sure you'll agree, the moment that you are diagnosed with something, or you've lived with something and evolved into an adult, you have empathy and compassion, but before that, it not maybe for your kids and other close loved ones, but it is a hard one emotion, both of them, to actually be able to experience, display, and really truly feel. And I know that from before and after my own daughter's death. So I think your work is amazing. I am going to put links to everything. And what is the name of your podcast so people can tune into that as well?
It's called Alopecia Life.
Okay.
I have a link.
Perfect.
Yeah. And I have a link to that on the website too. So
Yeah, you have a lot of resources, and I know our time is coming to an end for this episode, but I did want to ask you one last thing. I was going to ask it a little earlier, and I got a little bit sidetracked. Um, but another important component to this, and again, another similarity in our worlds, is siblings. And so the impact of one child in the family being diagnosed with something that makes them, quote, different. In your world, it's alopecia. And now all of a sudden, my brother or sister doesn't have, hair. And in my world, it's, oh, my brother or sister has died. And my world, it's not so visible it's not a physical difference. And in your world, I suppose it could be covered up. The difference could be covered up as well with, like you say, wigs, hats, and so on. But I'm just wondering if there is a stigma attached to alopecia today. I know we talked, at the beginning of this, you spoke a little bit about how our world has changed and kids are being presented with more autonomy and agency, which is absolutely wonderful. But having said that, I know when my daughter died by suicide in 2005, my son was 13, and he essentially has lived a double life to this day, meaning he doesn't talk about that. He hid all of that from school. There was no support for him, absolutely none. He was different. So in that regard, our worlds are similar. So I was just wondering before we wrap this up, if you have any advice for parents with children, and if any of their other children who are not, afflicted are having struggles with this, if the one child might be getting more attention because they're different and it makes the other children feel less, anything. I don't know if that's the case, but anything you can maybe share, tips to help parents on this subject, that'd be awesome.
yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that when we are dealing with chronic illness, which this is chronic illness, we don't call it a disease. I know a lot of people prefer not to call it a disease. We call it a condition, but it is chronic, right? It's going to be with us up and down. I mean, you could have complete regrowth, but it's still kind of maybe laying dormant. But with the siblings, it's really interesting because a lot of people will not talk to the child with alopecia. They'll go to the older brother or sister and say, hey, what's going on with your sister, brother? Why are they bald? Right. And so now they have to be a voice piece for their sibling. And that may be a role that they willingly take on, or it may be one that they don't want. Right. And so there should definitely be a conversation around it at home at some point, because it is important to say, you are your own person. You shouldn't have to speak up, whatever, unless you want to. And I do notice a lot of older siblings are just raring to go. They're like, I'm gonna take care of that person who said this or whatever. And that's kind of a normal reaction for some older siblings. But sometimes they're just like, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'm tired of it. Why are people asking me? And I know in my particular family, my younger sister developed asthma very soon after I had, I'm also a type 1 diabetic. So from the age of 2, so I was already giving insulin injections, and then I lost my hair. Then my younger sister developed asthma, and she was in crisis a lot when we were young. Having a child who can't breathe, that's a whole other world. And so the attention automatically goes to that, because you need to take care of these lungs, right? And so I think that probably in my situation, my family situation, my older sister was probably kind of feeling a little bit lost, and we don't really talk a lot about it. But when I was talking to my mom the other day, because I was actually working on that module about setting boundaries with our kids, because we don't want to give them everything they have just because they don't have hair, right? I mean, there's that piece. And then we talked about the sibling piece. And she said, yeah, it really was, the attention had to go to Andrea, my younger sister. And so I think that we didn't have the normal roles of how chronic illness hits, kind of were lost a little bit for me, but I don't regret that at all. I think that it just was the way it was, and you just kind of deal with it. But I do think that there needs to be a conversation with siblings for sure. And, in your son's case, I mean, I always recommend support, right? If there is support available out there. And then, he's 13. Does he really want to do that? He doesn't want to talk about it. I mean, he's broken too, for sure. And there's this, unwillingness to talk, but there's also a freedom in knowing that other people going to a bereavement group, a support group for teenagers can be really helpful. I know my own mother-in-law lost her dad when she was quite young, and something like that would have been really helpful. She talked about that as an adult. So
Yeah, sadly, they don't have that in Canada, where my daughter's death was a suicide, and there's like basically zero support for kids. And that stands today, which goes back to our opening dialogue about, lack of awareness, a lack of understanding, a lack of resources, and every voice counts. So on that note, every voice counts. I am going to wrap this up because, well, this was not a long conversation. It could have been, but it is enough to be the eye opener it's meant to be. And I really want to thank you again for sharing your experiences and giving us all a glimpse into your world, and the resources I do share in the description for this podcast can absolutely direct people who are experiencing alopecia or know someone that's experiencing alopecia to your site and book and so on. And I know that they'll find it very, very helpful. So thank you so much again, Deeann, for being a guest on my show. It was awesome.
thank you, Vonne. I really appreciate you having me. Thanks again.
All right. Talk soon.